Once again, the last 6 minutes of this video is going to have no audio.
Framing of economics as the science of scarcity. Scarcity is the fundamental and unavoidable phenomenon that creates a need for the science of economics. Without scarcity of time, scarcity of resources, scarcity of information, scarcity of consumable goods, and scarcity of peace and goodwill on earth, human beings will lack for nothing. Indeed, without scarcity, your life would be like that of the hardy partying couple in the Eagles' song Life in the Fast Lane. That is, you'd have everything all the time. Sadly though, scarcity is a fact. There isn't nearly enough time or stuff to satisfy all desires, so people have to make hard choices about what to produce and consume so that if they can't have everything, they can at least have the best that was possibly under the circumstances. Chapter 2 gets deep into scarcity and the trade-offs that it causes people to make. Chapter 3 builds on Chapter 2 by showing how economists analyze the decisions people make about how to best maximize human happiness in a world of scarcity. That process turns out to be intimately connected with a phenomenon known as diminishing returns, which describes the sad fact that each additional amount of resources that's thrown at a production process brings forth successively smaller amounts of output. Like scarcity, diminishing returns is unavoidable. And in Chapter 3, I explain how people very cleverly deal with the phenomenon in order to get the most out of humanity's limited pool of resources. Zooming out, microeconomics in the big picture. Part 2 of this book covers microeconomics, which treats the economy as a unified whole. Studying macroeconomics is useful because certain factors, such as interest rates, tax policy, have economy-wide effects, and also because when the economy goes into a recession or a boom, every person and every business is affected. Measuring the economy. In Chapter 4, I show how economists measure gross domestic product, GDP, the value of all goods and services produced in the economy in a given period of time, usually a quarter or a year. Totaling up this number is absolutely vital because it can't measure how the economy is doing. You can't tell whether government policies intended to improve the economy are helping or hurting. Inflation measures how prices in the economy change over time. This topic, which is the focus of Chapter 5, is crucial because high rates of inflation usually accompany huge economic problems, including deep recession and countries defaulting on their debts. It's also important to study inflation because poor government policy is the sole culprit behind high rates of inflation, meaning that governments are totally responsible when big inflation happens. Recognizing what causes recessions. Recessions linger only because institutional factors in the economy make it very hard for prices in the economy to fall. As I explained in Chapter 6, if prices could fall quickly and easily, recession would quickly resolve themselves. But because prices can't quickly and easily fall, economists have to develop anti-recessionary policies to help get economies out of recessions as quickly as possible. Fighting recessions with monetary and fiscal policies. The man most responsible for developing anti-recessionary policies was the English economist John Maynard Keynes, who in 1936 wrote the first macroeconomic book about fighting recessions. Chapter 6 introduces you to his model of the economy and how it explicitly takes account of the fact that prices can't quickly and easily fall to get out of recession. Because it takes that into account, it serves as the perfect vehicle for illustrating the two things that can help you get out of a recession. These two things are monetary and fiscal policy, which are covered in depth in Chapter 7. Monetary policy uses changes in the money supply to change interest rates in order to stimulate economic activity. For instance, if the government causes interest rates to fall, consumers borrow more money to buy things like houses and cars, thereby stimulating economic activity and helping to get the economy moving faster. Fiscal policy refers to increased government spending or lower tax rates to help fight recessions. For instance, if the government buys more goods and services, economic activity increases. In a similar fashion, the government cuts tax rates, consumers end up with higher tax incomes, which, when spent, increases economic activity. In the first decade after Keynes' anti-recessionary ideas were put into practice, they seemed to work really well. However, they didn't fare so well during the 1970s. and it became apparent that while monetary and fiscal policies were powerful anti-recessionary tools, they had their limitations. For this reason, Chapter 7 also covers how and why monetary and fiscal policy are constrained in their effectiveness. The key concept is called rational expectations. It explains how rational people very often change their behavior in response to policy changes in ways that limit the effectiveness of those changes. It's a concept that you need to understand if you're going to come up with informed opinions about current macroeconomic policy debates. Getting up close and personal. Microeconomics. While macroeconomics is concerned with government policies to improve the overall economy, microeconomics gets down to the nitty-gritty, studying the most fundamental economic agents, individuals and firms. Balancing supply and demand. In a modern economy, individuals and firms produce and consume everything that gets made. Consequently, Part 3's coverage of microeconomics begins in Chapter 8 by focusing on how supply and demand determine prices and output levels in competitive markets. This is a logical place to begin because producers determine supply, consumers determine demand, and their interactions in the market determines what gets made and how much it costs. Chapter 9 digs in deeper to see how individuals make economic decisions about how to get the most happiness out of their limited incomes. These decisions generate the demand curve that affects prices and output levels in markets. In a similar way, the profit-maximizing decisions of firms generate the supply curve that affects markets. In Chapter 10, I explain how that happens, and I also explain how profit-maximizing firms usually go about maximizing their profits. If you have ever had nasty thoughts about capitalism, this chapter will put you eyeball to eyeball with the enemy. Considering why competition is so great. You may not feel warm and fuzzy about profit-maximizing firms, but economists love them. Just as long as they're stuck in competitive industries, the reasons, briefly, is that firms are forced to compete and end up satisfying two wonderful conditions. First, they're allocatively efficient, which simply means that they produce the goods and services that consumers most greatly desire to consume. Second, they're productively efficient, which means that they produce these goods and services at the lowest possible cost. These two great facts in competitive firms are the basis of Adam Smith's famous invisible hand, the idea that when constrained by competition, each firm's greed ends up causing it to act in a socially optimal way, as if guided to do the right thing by an invisible hand. I discuss this idea and much more about the benefits of competition in Chapter 11. Maximizing problems caused by a lack of competition. Unfortunately, not every firm is constrained by competition, and when that happens, firms don't end up acting in a socially optimal way. The most extreme case is monopoly, a situation where there's only one firm in an industry, meaning that it has absolutely no competition. As I explained in Chapter 12, monopolies behave very badly, restricting output in order to drive up prices and inflate profits. These actions, which hurt consumers, go on indefinitely unless the government takes steps to regulate the firm's behavior. A less extreme case of lack of competition is oligopoly, a situation where there are only a few firms in an industry. Such situations, firms often make deals not to compete against each other, so that they can keep prices high and make bigger profits. In Chapter 13, I examine oligopoly firms in depth. I explain not only how they misbehave, but also the fact that they often have a hard time keeping their agreements with each other to maintain high prices and high profits. This fact means that oligopoly firms often end up competing against each other, despite their best efforts not to. Consequently, government regulation isn't always needed. Reforming property rights. Markets and competition can only be relied upon to produce socially beneficial results if society sets up a good system of property rights. Almost all pollution issues, as well as cases of species loss, are the direct result of poorly designed property rights generating perverse incentives to do bad things. Economists take this problem very seriously and have done their best to reform property rights in order to alleviate pollution and eliminate species loss. I discuss these issues in detail in Chapter 14. Dealing with other common market failures. Monopolies, oligopolies, and poorly designed property rights all lead to what economists like to call market failures. situation where markets deliver socially non-optimal outcomes. Two other common causes of market failures are asymmetric information and public goods. Asymmetric information refers to situations in which either the buyer or the seller knows more about the quality of the goods that they're negotiating over than does the other party. Because of the uneven playing field and the suspicion it creates, a lot of potentially beneficial economic transactions never get completed. Public goods refers to goods or services that are impossible to provide to just one person. If you provide them to one person, you have to provide them to everybody. Think of a firework display, for example. The problem is that most people try to get the benefit without paying for it. I discuss both these situations and ways to deal with them in Chapter 15.